Welcome back to part 2 of chapter 1. Now we're going to go a little bit further into the interpersonal communication models, as well as really kind of take a look at some of the aspects that we need to cover. We can't cover everything in the introduction chapter, of course, but it sets us up for later on. When we hit that, you can say, oh yeah, I remember this part from the introduction. Traits of interpersonal communication. These are some things we need to always consider when we're looking at our communication that we're engaging in and how we're engaging in it. You can never take back communication. You can apologize, you can try to make up for it, you can try to ignore it, but once after it's out there, you've communicated and you can't take that back. It will change a relationship, it will make a relationship, it will break a relationship, or it may find new relationships. The thing is, once after we communicate, you can't uncommunicate. We also need to understand we can dehumanize others in our speech, and that is one thing we want to avoid. Especially in close relationships, we don't want to dehumanize our spouse and treat them as an object. We want to ensure that they are fully part of our communication and that we're treating them as another person. We also need to understand there is an aspect of ethnocentrism in our communication. We like for our in-groups, the groups that we're part of, to be promoted. And so we have a tendency to take down other groups. Think of it as a sports fan. If you're a Denver Nuggets fan, for instance, you're always talking about how great the Nuggets are, but not the greatness of the Minnesota Timberwolves, for instance. And you have a tendency to try to promote that inner group. And this happens across cultures, it happens in nations, so it's something that we encounter, and we need to be aware that we have that tendency so we can communicate better. And there's really no neutrality when we go into talking to others. We're part of that conversation, and we want to make sure we're promoting our part of that. And we need to learn to step back from that. So we need to understand we have some of our prejudice, some of our biases. Maybe we really hate the Kansas City Chiefs because we grew up in Denver. We need to understand when we're talking to someone wearing a Kansas City Chiefs jersey that they're still a person. They still have important things to say. Just because they're a fan of that team doesn't mean we need to let our prejudice against the team impact our communication. This is something we commonly see. You might write the perfect speech. You might have the perfect thing to say. You may have found the best words. But guess what? That's a small part of your communication. In all honesty, body language has a big part of it. If you walk around and you're talking to people with your hands open, it's more of a welcoming thing. Meanwhile, if you cross your arms, you're closing them off. There's a whole aspect of nonverbal communication. Entire courses are taught on this. It's a fun class if you get the chance to take it. It really kind of gets you thinking about how you're communicating beyond the words that you're choosing. Finally, tone and inflections. If you come in and say, I'm so excited, I'm just really thrilled to be here today. Does that get it across? Or, I'm so excited, I'm so happy to be here today. Same words, but the tone and inflection completely changed it. And this happens when we talk about relationships later on, that this becomes very important. If you're at a party and you're down and it's coming across in your body language and your tone, people aren't going to believe you. Meanwhile, if you're at a very important meeting and everyone's very formal and you're giggling and giddy, it may come across sending the wrong message. So tone and inflection plays a big part of how we communicate. There are principles of interpersonal communication. includes the nonverbal, like we were just talking about, and the context. That again is the location. So we need to look at if the location, if your significant other's pulled you aside and they're being very serious and you're making jokes, they're not going to feel that they're communicating with you, and that becomes a barrier. There's also communication about communication. It's meta communication, where we're doing that kind of right here. We're talking about how we communicate, and it's a form of learning how to better communicate. A paralanguage and mixed messages. We've all seen these on the TV shows and movies where someone's going to head out and go do something, and all right, honey, I'm going to go bowling tonight. And the spouse looks at them and says, oh, please do. Go right ahead. Once again, you get that mixed message. The words don't match up. You can't reverse your communication, as we talked about. And interpersonal communication is very dynamic. I mean, you might come from that very formal, very professional meeting, but once after you walk out of that meeting room door, you're going to talk to your best friend, and you're not going to talk to him in that formal fashion anymore. Instead, you're going to change and talk to him in how you talk to your friends. So it becomes dynamic. You might have been talking one way inside, but outside it's a totally different world. Now, we've all seen Maslow's hierarchy pyramid. And what does communication have to do with Maslow? Well, think about it. In many ways, our communication is how we go up the scale. If you're young, you're a baby, and you're hungry, you cry. You're meeting your physiological needs through communication. You're saying, feed me! And so you're crying, and so that gets the message across. Safety, this is how we communicate if you're feeling safe or if you don't feel safe. Belonging, this is very important. I mean, those love messages that we send to each other very much comes down to communication. If you don't communicate with someone, they don't know how important they are, and so that you don't feel like you belong and you don't feel loved. Your esteem, part of our esteem comes from our sphere of influence, which we'll talk about in a couple chapters. Just hang in there with me. But part of that comes from how our peers and how others actually show that we're respected and that there's esteem there. And that builds up our self-confidence and our ego. And self-actualization, that is all part of reflection. As a matter of fact, when you go and you're going to look at the first TED Talk that I share with you, that really goes into the self-actualization. So please realize how we achieve in life is oftentimes based on our communication. We have motivation for communicating. Now, you've all heard of the elevator speech, or you will hear of the elevator speech, and that's a short 1-minute introduction that you can do about yourself to, say, a potential boss or someone that you might want to make a sales to. And so it's a presentation. You're presenting yourself. We also do that on dates. We're creating a presentation. We're going out to be the best person that we are, so we can get the attention of someone that we're attracted to. Or perhaps we're going to go see our grandparents, or we're going to see some relatives we haven't seen in a while. You want to go there and present yourself in a certain way. Class reunions, same thing. There's instrumental goals. Perhaps you want that new job. Perhaps you want to make a sale. Perhaps you want someone to be interested in you. And for that reason, we actually create a persuasive argument of sorts. Now, when I have Plato up here, but Plato's only part of the trilogy of the Greeks here, we start off with Socrates, whose student was Plato, and who's had another student, Aristotle. And Aristotle actually brings in the ethos, pathos, and logos. The ethos that you're talking about is a case of your credibility, your standing, your pathos. That is the emotional appeal that you're making in an argument, and logos is the logical portion of it. And the reason why I bring up Plato first is because he wasn't necessarily in agreement with we find truth through persuasion. Instead, he felt that persuasion actually blocked us from the truth. And so he did not believe in that, as Aristotle was really the person that believed in it. And we have relationship goals that we maintain through interpersonal communication. We'll talk about that a lot in the upcoming chapters because, as I mentioned, that's how we achieve being our greater self, is through communication. Now, when we want to study communication, we utilize the scientific process. We actually need to come up with a question: how's my communication affecting them? And is it making people like me or dislike me? And so you have a question. So then you come up with a hypothesis. I think how I communicate is making people like me. So that becomes your hypothesis. And then you do research. You find out, okay, how many friends do I make when I talk this way versus how many friends do I make when I talk that way? And then you analyze the information as it comes in. Boy, I was sarcastic all day yesterday and no one was near me the entire day because they can't stand it. So you're going to change how you communicate. Now, there are quantitative research that we do into interpersonal communication, which goes back to, such as the graph that we showed, where only 7% is the words that we choose. That's a statistic. The qualitative, though, is more of a feeling. It's more of, when I talk to you this way, how did you feel? And they tell you. You're not writing down numbers. You're not keeping a quantitative calculation for it. Instead, you're just looking at the qualitative. Do I have good relationships through how I communicate? Yes or no, and why? So there's different methods we use to study. And this is not just in our own personal lives, but it goes all the way up through communication theory, and there are 7 traditions of communication. This is all part of that. Competence. Constantly communicating in ways that are appropriate, effective, and ethical. That's our goal for competence. We want to communicate appropriately with people. We want to communicate effectively with them, and we want it to be ethical. We're seeing a lot with ethics right now not being thought of in our communication. And that's something we need to really consider, is if we're trying to persuade someone about something, is it just totally selfish purpose, or is it for a general good? And so you have to look at the ethics of that. That will come up again. Interpersonal communication competence, appropriateness. You need to communicate appropriate for the culture that you're in, for the situation that you're in, and for the relationship that you're in. When you come home and you see your family members, you run up and you hug them. When you go to work, you may not run up to all your coworkers and hug them. That's not appropriate in that situation. When you're at the grocery store, you don't just give the cashier a big hug, unless you know them, but that's a different relationship. So you're looking for that. Another aspect of it is that cultural, and we'll talk more about culture in a moment. Self-monitoring. We have people that are high self-monitors that really overthink their communication at times, and that can hinder theirs. But at the same time, they're making sure that they're in the proper situation and that they're communicating in the proper way. So there is positive and negative with both of these. So high self-monitoring avoids those awkward situations. You realize you're online and you shouldn't say this. Meanwhile, you realize, hey, I'm at a wedding, I shouldn't say that type of thing. So you're definitely monitoring how you're communicating all the time. Low self-monitors just express themselves. And we'll have a TED Talk later on that talks about the 3 types of communication that we do. I'll give you a little preview for it. It's if you're a looker, if you're a listener, or if you're a toucher. And when we get to that, you'll say, oh yeah, I remember you brought that up earlier. And if you overemphasize appropriateness, it can restrict communication, but there are situations when that's absolutely necessary and a situation where it's not. If you're at work, overemphasizing appropriateness won't hurt you. If you're in a relationship with a person and you overemphasize appropriateness, they may feel that you're detached and you're not communicating and they're removed from them. So you have to pretty much do a juggling thing where you need to be aware of where you are with some self-monitoring, but at the same time you want the low self-monitoring where you're still expressing how you truly feel. Ethics. As I mentioned, Plato really desired for dialogue to discover the truth. He did not feel that persuasion and rhetoric was the way you reached it because everyone's in it for their own gain. And how can you find the truth if you're just trying to convince people? So his was more of a introspectional aspect of it where you engage in it in order to find the truth, not to find out who's right and who's wrong. And that's really a hard concept as far as the truth versus right and wrong, because you can be wrong but it not be the truth. And it's just something to think about as we go forward. Now, as I mentioned, who died and left Aristotle in charge of ethics? And it was Plato. Plato died and Aristotle was his student and took over. But Aristotle believed in what's called deliberative rhetoric, which is what we're supposed to be engaging in as a society. We're supposed to be looking for the greater good and finding the path forward to that. And there can be different journeys that are different paths that people feel this is the correct path to reach this better good. But then we have to actually have a discourse. We need to communicate with others, and this can happen within families. You might feel, hey, I got this great job opportunity in Seattle. We all going to move and leave there because you're thinking that's for the greater good. But your kids might be like, I don't want to live in Seattle. I don't want to leave my school. It's not for the greater good. So then you have to engage in some type of persuasion where you're both trying to figure out what the greater good is. Issues with interpersonal communication. Culture can be an issue. Here in the United States, we have this thing about look them in the eye. They looked me square in the eye. I could tell they were telling the truth. In other cultures, if you look a person in the eyes, you're disrespecting them. So you might have some type of cultural symbol, some type of cultural behavior that contradicts the other. We might be experiencing a change of that right now. We live in the Western United States. In the Western United States, a good strong handshake. That's how you introduce yourself. Is that how we're going to introduce ourselves a year from now? Now that we've had the pandemic and we're all kind of locked in and we're being taught about social distancing, that good strong handshake may not communicate what it communicated a decade ago. Realize that we're in a world of many cultures, and we have a tendency, like I just did a minute ago, United States, Western United States. We did a regional aspect of it, but within those, there are many. Take music industry, for instance. You have country, you have jazz, you have R&B, you have pop, you have heavy metal, you have all these different things. Those are all different cultures under the music culture. And how many people make up a culture? It might be just a small group. So you need to understand there's high context and low context cultures that we'll talk about later on, where some cultures, they're really not looking at the words you're choosing. They're just looking at your actions and your body language. And there are other ones where, man, the words you choose are what is important, and they don't really read the other parts. We'll talk about that when we get to cultures. Issues with interpersonal communication, unconscious about the motivation. We need to be self-reflective, and that comes up in the next chapter, where we need to really look at, okay, why am I communicating this way? Am I being ethical in my communication? What is my true motivation? And that's going to require a lot of self-reflection. The problem with encoding, if we're looking to gain something, we might encode that message that we're sending differently, and it might be a form of manipulation. Like I said, we're talking about the Western United States, so when I want to introduce someone, I might not be a tactile person. I don't like, but I'm still going to give that strong handshake because I'm trying to convince them. I'm trying to sell a product or something of that variety. So we'll definitely talk about this going forward with, if we're not looking at why we're communicating, that can lead to troubles as well. Inaccurate perception. Have you ever looked at someone and just, you make a judgment quickly, but you have to put that judgment aside if you're going to communicate with them. You cannot let that judgment change how you're interacting with people. If a person has a stereotype, like we talked about that person with a sports jersey on, he's wearing a New York one, so that means he's a fast talker, and we throwing all these stereotypes for New Yorkers in there. Never sleeps, up 24 hours a day, probably does a lot of party. All those are stereotypes, and we based it off of they're wearing a sports team jersey. So we have to put our perceptions aside when we start communicating with others. And sometimes we don't recognize what the other communication that's going on. We're not recognizing the nonverbal communication. We're not recognizing the tone or the paralanguage. Instead, we're just focused on sending our message. And we're going to send our message, and I don't care what they think, I'm just sending the message. And then our communication fails because we didn't recognize the barriers that were being put up. So it's important that we recognize the emotional factors of it. So what we talked about today in this very first class is we defined interpersonal communication. We looked at the different channels, the communication model, the traits, the principles, motivation, and some of the issues. There's a lot of issues that could come up in this. So what I want you to do, if you didn't respond to that first section that we did, I want you to go ahead and respond here and think about what type of communication you want to achieve through this class. Do you want to build better relationships? Are you looking for a new job? Are you looking to be more successful in your career of the job you already have? Are you starting a family and you want to look at how do I communicate with my children? Or are you looking at how do I hit that 30-year anniversary? So you can post that down below. And if you have any questions, please feel free to message me, email me, and I'm going to be putting up a link here in just a little while. I'm going to offer a Meet Your Professor on a WebEx, as well as I'm going to establish an office hours where if you want to just come in and join me on WebEx, you can ask questions that way if you feel better communicating with a video versus just writing.